Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
A lot of Western researchers have talked a lot about this in their own countries and contributed to the discussion. But unfortunately, where it's central in Bharat, both in the informal sector and in the formal sector in terms of both at the corporate and the individual level, while cultural norms and narratives play a central role in economic decision making. But there's barely any research in this country.
Did Rajaraja Chola, who built the world-renowned Brihadisvara temple in Tanjore, and Suryavarman II of Kambuja, Desa, who built the world's largest temple complex, Angkor Wat, erect these enduring marvels with a magic wand? How did they nurture prosperity? What were the economic models that enabled them to leave the world awestruck? Sriram Balasubramanian's sequel to the pathbreaking Kautilyanomics answers these questions by examining the common era empires and kingdoms ranging from the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas and Vijayanagara to the Southeast Asian kingdoms. Balasubramanian audaciously puts forward a novel, indigenous and sustainable framework called Dharmanomics, a function of Kautilyan Dharmic Capitalism, of a dharmic ecosystem driven by temples and Sreni Dharma that span thousands of years. It was put into practice much before the likes of Adam Smith and the modern economic thinkers. In this episode, Sriram Balasubramanian, together with Vikram Bhatt, delve into the concept of Dharmanomics to present a coherent and structured economic framework based on the idea of Dharma. This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Centre in November of 2024.
I'd like to be brief, but I'll start off with two sort of questions that triggered me into my research. So the first question is, what is really the indigenous Bharatiya model of, or the Bharatiya economic model? This was something that, as Bharat becomes a superpower, or in the path of becoming a superpower, one of the things that's likely to happen in the next 10, 15 years is the question, Bharat's ideas will take mainstream. In the sense, what defines us? What are the ideas that we have brought to the table? So obviously the economic ideas of Bharat will also become mainstream, because without economics, you don't really find, because economics takes center stage much more than other sort of streams and professions, purely by the nature of the subject. So when I was dealing with this question, I obviously looked at the past and I tried to make some sense of if there is any literature available on defining this economic model. Because often the answer that I was given was, Swadeshi was the answer to this question. In my view, that really isn't an answer, because Swadeshi was a political movement, which is in response to the freedom movement. But if you really look at, say, thousands of years of our history, what I noticed is that, Bharat and China were the most dominant countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita over a period of, say, 1,500 years. Angus Maddison, a lot of people would have heard of him, was a world-renowned historian. He had done some work. Besides Madison's work, there's also a lot of anecdotal and secondary evidence which showcases this prosperity. And that includes, of course, in the introduction, we mentioned about the Brihadisvara temple and the Angkor Wat. These are all not just sort of religious institutions, but they are engineering marvels which are even difficult to sort of even replicate even today. So did these things just happen out of thin air, or there was some thinking behind it, some level of thought process behind it? So that's when I chanced upon the Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text, for those who are not aware, written by Kautilya, Chanakya. And the text is meant to be a sort of a template, a set of ideas for economic governance during Kautilya's, around the 3rd century BCE. It also reflects a set of, it doesn't prescribe any sort of model per se, but it gives you a set of ideas based on the idea of Dharma. And that's when I bring about this concept called Dharmic Capitalism. Dharma is a very sort of multidimensional word, but for the narrow sort of definition of economic policy, I define it through ethics, responsibilities, and institutions, and harmony. Ethics, in terms of clean institutions, clean administration, clean leadership. Harmony in terms of engaging with the rest of the world. Wealth creation with the rest of the world. And then responsibilities in terms of familial, societal, and environmental responsibilities. So all of this maps to a structure which talks about a state that is strong but doesn't micromanage, wealth creation by engaging the rest of the world in terms of trade, in terms of commerce. Often we are told that we somehow became open only after the liberalization reforms of 1990. But the reality is we have been an open society engaging the rest of the world for thousands of years. And that sort of spirit of wealth creation while engaging with the world is another important component of this. And then the entire idea of sustainability. We talk about climate change, we talk about the issues related to climate change. All these were all sort of central to what Kautilya was prescribing. So my first book sort of deals with all this and then contextualize it to today's economic structure. So in Dharmanomics, what I try to do is to showcase a continuity of this. In my research, when I look at the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagara Empire, Cambodia, which I call Kambuja Desa, which was called Kambuja Desa, Champa, which is Vietnam today, and then Java and a wide range of Southeast Asian kingdoms, you see that between the early CE period, especially between 5th or 6th century CE till almost 13th and 14th century CE, a lot of these kingdoms had Dharma-based economic frameworks. So when I mean Dharma-based economic frameworks, what I mean is foundationally Dharma was an important component of their economic governance. So in this book, I try to showcase this through three buckets. One is the Dharmic Capitalism, which I mentioned, of Kautilya. Another is what I call the Dharmic ecosystem, which is basically the temple-based economies. If you go to Cambodia, if you travel in Cambodia, you would notice that there would be shivlings and temples in villages which are just there. They're all non-functional temples now, but they were sort of integral to their governance and to their structure of the economy, in early CE. So you see this in a lot of these Southeast Asian kingdoms. So the temple, I try to view this not just as a sort of a religious institution, which is of course important and it has its own role, and also as an economic institution. How the temple-based economies creates an ecosystem around the temple, which creates an economic factor of multiplication for a lot of these societies. So the second part of it is this Dharmic ecosystem, which I mentioned. And the third is what I call the Sreni Dharma. The Srenis were like corporate guilds of those times. These corporate guilds played a very important role in maritime trade. For example, there was a corporate guild which is called Ainurvar. In Tamil, it's called 500. In fact, it was started in Karnataka by a group of folks in Karnataka. And it's a huge guild, which is basically you can call a guild a sort of a multinational corporation in today's times. They had offices in various parts of Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Cambodia, in Vietnam. And in fact, when Rajendra Chola, that is Rajaraja Chola's son, Rajaraja Chola built the Brihadisvara temple, his son Rajendra Chola, he was the one who traversed and conquered, went over to Southeast Asia and conquered. One of the major reasons that triggered his conquest was that this particular guild, which played a very important role in financing the Cholas, they were trading towards China. So if you want to trade towards China, even today, you have to go via the Straits of Malacca and via Singapore. And these guilds were, sort of not given access, or they were sort of prevented from trading by the Srivijaya kingdom, which used to rule Indonesia. So the Cholas had to confront this, and this was one of the reasons why Rajendra Chola had to go and conquer this place, so that sort of liberate the guilds and so that they can, sort of trade with the rest of Asia and go to China and trade as well. So what I'm trying to say is the importance of commerce was there in even the political dynamics of a lot of these kingdoms. And the guilds played a very important role. And these Srenis were also governed by a system based on the idea of Dharma. So for example, since I mentioned they're a corporation, so they had elections to nominate members of this corporation. They were very egalitarian. They had people across caste, across creed. And they also had people who are from different countries as well. For example, some Jews were part of some of these corporate guilds because they were also engaging in commerce. So this is another sort of, component which I deal with in the book. And this goes across these kingdoms, and I've traveled to many of these places. I went to Cambodia, I've been to a lot of these places to understand more about the inscriptions. Because one of the important things that one needs to do, especially when dealing with economic history, is what I call triangulation of evidence. Because data per se is a bit scarce, because we're talking about thousands of years back. So the veracity of data is a bit of an issue. But we do have data. So data is one component of the analysis. Another component is what I call secondary research, which means this is sort of inscriptions, analyzing the inscriptions, decoding these inscriptions, and forming a narrative based on the inscriptions, a thematic narrative based on the inscriptions. And third is what I call anecdotal evidence, right? Which means you have a lot of these travelers and travelogues of people who have traveled in Bharat during that time. For example, there are Chinese embassy notes, which the Cholas had when they had sent missionaries to the to China to engage with them. So these embassy notes provide us good form of evidence. You have Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is again a travelogue by a person who traveled to these places for trade. And then you have Greek traveler accounts and a variety of these anecdotal evidence. So sort of these three forms of evidence need to be sort of triangulated for us to form a thematic impression. And that's how a lot of my research and the data and the analysis that comes in these books, that's how I bring about the analysis. So the obvious question is, how does all this relate today to us, right? Because we are living in 2024 and we want to know, how does this relate to us? And I think this leads to my second research question, because when I started this talk, I mentioned that I had two research questions. One was on the indigenous model. Second is the role of culture, norms, and narratives in economic decision making. So if you really look at our sort of consumption patterns, like how do we spend? How do common people spend? If you really look at the data, much of our discretionary spending, we have discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Right? Non-discretionary is essential spending. Like you have to go for a medical checkup, or you have to pay rent, or your basic things that you spend on. And then discretionary spending, where you have a choice. Most of our discretionary spending is aligned to a lot of the cultural activities that we have throughout the year. Whether it is, for example, the highest number of UPI transactions in this calendar year was during the week of Diwali, compared to any other week during the entire year. So much of our discretionary spending, especially in Bharat, is linked intrinsically to the cultural prism of Bharat. When I mean cultural prism, it includes festivals, it includes occasions, it includes a variety of things. But a lot of these things determine our choices. So the way of life that we talk about is not something that just originated today. It's a consequence of many, many decades of existence and experience. And I think understanding this way of life is very important for us to, and understanding how these choices are made is very important for us to formulate economic policy. Because, only when you get a better understanding of these choices, people or policymakers can tweak policy to make it more effective. And this is just not at the individual level, right? If you take at the corporate level, let's take the top 10, 15 businesses in this country, right? Most of them, if not all of them, are all family-owned businesses in some form or the other. They might be publicly listed, but they're all governed by a central family that runs most of these businesses. And family-owned businesses make economic choices not completely on rationality. They make economic choices based on a wide range of factors, of which their cultural, societal norms play a very important role in their decision-making. So even at the corporate level, I think there is a very strong case for cultural norms and narratives and their role in economic decision-making and business decision-making. And I think that needs to be studied more. And this is studied across the world. I mean, if you look at, there are Nobel laureates in the US who have studied a lot of these things. For example, Gary Becker, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, one of his earlier works in the US was on the role of discrimination and culture in the United States. Gary Eckleroff, George Eckleroff, who won the Nobel in 2001 for asymmetric information, his stream of research talks a lot about identity economics. The role of, again, identities, role of norms, cultural norms in decision making. And similarly, Abner Grieve has done some work from Stanford. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of Western researchers have talked a lot about this in their own countries. and contributed to the discussion. But unfortunately, where it's central in Bharat, both in the informal sector and in the formal sector in terms of both at the corporate and the individual level, well, cultural norms and narratives play a central role in economic decision making. But there's barely any research in this country. So I think the idea of this research is to answer these two, big questions, and then draw and provide a qualitative framework through the Dharma-based economic frameworks to argue that this way of life is defined through, centuries of experience, not just the spiritual realm, but also at the economic, practical, sort of, commercial realm as well. And we need to sort of understand this and debate and discuss this more. And that's where that's where my interest in this led me to these books. And my third book, which is coming out in probably a year and a half, deals with how some of these things, how some of these ideas will percolate, could be used for the current context to ensure more effective policy implementation. I think that's something we'll probably further discuss with Vikram, and with this I will sort of just wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Let me start with a few operating definitions so that we're all on the same page. And a lot of the thinking around whether it's economics or ways of life in the Indic tradition get caught up in the sort of the norms, the words and the vocabulary of it, but the deeper meaning gets missed. So you basically have three really core ideas. One is your the idea of Dharmanomics. The second is the Sreni, the Srenis, and the third is your KDC, right? Like the main model. So each one of these, but also like the idea of Dharma itself. Can you just kind of give us an operating definition so we're all on the same page?
Let's start with Dharma itself. I think we can write multiple books on defining Dharma, right? So I'm not going to be, sacrosanct here to talk, give a lecture on Dharma, because I don't neither have the intellectual depth nor the anubhava or the experience to debate on that topic. But having said that, through the narrow prism of economic policy, because Dharma is a very multidimensional word. So in the book, for example, I give examples of things like Saucham, cleanliness, various definitions of Dharma for the curious. But for the prism of purely economic construct, like I mentioned, I define it through three pillars. One is through ethics, basically ethics through the prism of a clean administration, clean leadership, again referring to the state, and also a business environment which is, corruption free and clean. And then I look at this another bucket of harmony. Harmony is just not just communal harmony, but sort of harmony with engaging with the rest of the world. Because if you notice one thing throughout our history, I'm talking about even Saraswati Sindhu civilization onwards or even prior, you could find that we have continuously engaged with the rest of the world, right? For example, the highest deposit of Roman coins besides Europe is found in southern India in around one century CE. Right? Highest deposit of Roman coins, which are basically the barometer for Europe to trade with. So what I'm trying to say is a large, irrespective of who ruled these places, it could be, the Cholas, it could be Pallavas, it could be any kingdom. Most of them had a base, Generally, right, when you have a political sort of entity, that political dispensation sort of rules, tries to, get their ideas to the people, right? In this particular case, what you notice is that this is something that you find across board. And these guys are fighting with each other every other, year for whatever, small wars, big wars, whatever you can call it. But this undercurrent of engaging with the rest of the world was there as part of their sort of lifestyle and ecosystem. So the second part of it is through what I define as harmony. And third part, very important, is on responsibilities. Because much of the Anglo-Saxon narrative is all about, rights, and the role of rights and what rights have to do with everything, right? I'm not saying that, Kautilya or our thinkers did not think about rights. They saw rights as an important component, but they saw responsibilities as a bigger focus, because responsibilities works in a form of an autopilot, right? So if there's a societal moral obligation to society for whatever reason, you don't need the state to come and tell you to do this, right? Because there's a moral obligation, say, between me and you. Say, for example, you're my brother, for example, right? And then there is a moral obligation for me to take care of yourself, right? I don't need the state to come and tell you that this guy needs to be taken care of, right? So what I'm trying to say is, so Kautilya argues, or the idea of dharma, through which Kautilya argues, is the role of responsibility is not just at the societal level, not at the familial level, and even at the environmental level. The broader, focus on environment, because one of the definitions of dharma is again saucham, which is cleanliness, for example, right? So intrinsically, the need to protect the environment, the need to protect social, structures is an inbuilt concept, through the definition of dharma. So this is how I have sort of defined it in the previous book as well as I extend it here. Yeah. Of course, there could be other versions of, definitions of dharma, and there could be books written on it. But purely in this type of an exercise, you want to, make it a bit more focused, and you want to make it a bit more, so that the common people can sort of absorb what you're trying to say. So in that attempt, I've sort of, narrowed it down to that prism.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to reiterate, it's very easy to go in circles when we talk about ideas like these. So just from the book, there is ethics, there's harmony, and there's responsibilities, which form the core of this book's notion of dharma and how then it flows into economics. This is an article which was reviewing your previous book, which talks about this idea, which lesser known fact, that Adam Smith, before Wealth of Nations, he was a moral philosopher. And he had published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which, from what I'm hearing from you, it almost seems like it's a moral imperative, right? Like the idea of dharma, and particularly as you mentioned it, relating to responsibilities. Right. My question though is, it's sort of like the how of it, right? Like in the sense, how do we make sure that this actually plays out? Everyone knows what the right thing to do is. How does one make sure that it's happening without danda, right? Like without punishment or disincentivizing it. So thoughts on that?
Right. So an extension of this is also the role that dharma can play in the modern structure, right? So in the modern macroeconomy, we have the state as an entity, and then we have the market as an entity, right? So the state is basically, what does the state do? I mean, if there's an economic, say, crisis, the government, either reduces taxes, stimulates the economy, or pumps in money in terms of infrastructure, like Gati Shakti, for example, so that you stimulate economic activity, right? So the state plays an important role in stimulating the economic balance, right? On the other hand, you have the market, right? You have the market players who are, competing in the market. You have economies of scale, you compete in the marketplace, and then you expand your business, and then, the economic churn, aggregates and does that. Kautilya's argument is that the role of dharma is a foundation to this binary. He looks beyond this binary of the state and the market, right? Imagine you have a variable which is beyond the state and the market and can influence both of the state and the market. So for example, so dharma serves as a foundation. Let me give you a practical example, right? So say there is corruption in the state, right?
Yeah.
There is corruption in bureaucracy and in some, parts of the administration, right? So Kautilya's argument is that if it's a more dharmic society, the propensity for that individual to be corrupt or in the state becomes lesser, okay? No, it doesn't extinguish it, but it at least provides a moral sort of fabric for that individual at the state to be less corrupt. Similarly, at the market, most of you would have heard of something called moral hazard, right? Moral hazard is basically if there's a big firm and there's a small firm competing in a particular marketplace, then the big firm has an undue advantage because it's a big firm, it controls a lot of factors. You ideally want to have a platform which is fair, which provides free competition, so that both of them can compete in the same marketplace. So to avoid moral hazard, Kautilya again advocates for a more dharmic approach to business. And he argues that through this approach, you sort of create a much more fairer and equitable environment. So what I'm trying to say is the stresses that you have in the state and the market can be sort of leveraged by this idea of dharma as a foundation. So that's how a lot of our thinkers in the past have envisaged this, because they see this as a way of life what people are living. So when you communicate in that language to them, it resonates far more with them from their past experience into these practical norms.
But I'm going to push a little more here. I still don't hear the how. I feel like the only way it seems to play out, especially in a country like ours where we don't need to discuss corruption, what in short of punishment or some kind of consequence, what do you advocate as a concept of Dharmanomics to create this? For people to be more moral.
Okay, so you're talking about the current context, right?
Yeah.
So I've shared a lot of these things in my upcoming book, but having said that, I will try to throw some ideas, right?
Yeah.
So one is this concept of dharmic nudges, that the entire nudge theory. I think your audience would be aware, where you basically have a public policy situation. Say, for example, tax compliance, right? How many people pay taxes, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things, say, in a nudge theory is you sort of put them into the tax bracket by default, and if for some reason they don't need to pay taxes, they withdraw the taxation from it. So that way your amount of compliance is far higher than lesser. So similarly, in policy initiatives, there can be various nudges that can be done to sort of expand policy, right? So let's take the Swachh Bharat initiative, which we all are aware about. Why is it that the Swachh Bharat initiative is far more effective in rural areas compared to, say, urban areas like Bengaluru, right? I think there is a reason, because most of, when you go to, in all our neighborhoods and all our houses, we're all very clean. We have a natural propensity to be clean. The idea of Saucham, which I mentioned. But somehow we don't translate it to the neighborhoods. So in the Swachh Bharat initiative, once they set up a lot of these Swachhata, clinics, in all these rural areas, they made a very conscious attempt to appeal to the people on the Saucham aspect of why it is important from a dharmic lens for them to be clean, and the need for them to bring it to their society, to the neighborhood outside. And through the scheme, the massive popularity of the Prime Minister and the huge scheme that was advocated, it has had a profound effect. I mean, for example, I'm just back from a very rural village in Tamil Nadu, where it has made a transformative effect, where people are naturally doing this because they feel a natural need. They see it's their way of life to do this, and they have brought it to their neighborhood. They see a conscious attempt to do this. So this is an example of compliance of a public policy which can be improved if you understand the way of life far better, in my view. Right. Similarly, I'll give you another example, right? So, in fact, I mentioned this the previous time I was here. The sovereign gold scheme that the RBI floated. The RBI basically has a gold scheme where people can deposit their gold to the bank in a particular bond, and then after maturity of the bond, you get back a new tranche of gold, and whatever excess maturity that you get out of it, right? When they initially floated the scheme became had a lot of issues. So they did a survey among all the participants. The single biggest reason why the scheme wasn't successful was when Indian women wanted to give their gold, they wanted the same gold back after 3 years. The same gold back after 3 years, irrespective of the overall value. So what they were saying is, you give me back the same gold, the rest of it you give me in new tranche of gold, you give me in cash, I don't care, right? I want the same gold back, right? This is a very, very important idea. Gold is just not about productivity. It's a sentimental asset in this country because it's come through many generations. Women who are the central of the household of most families in this country make choices which are based on ideas that we are talking about. So what the RBI did was they after a couple of iterations, they brought about the possibility of doing this as well, where they could give you back the same gold through some other form. So the effectiveness of policy is increased. Imagine if you are a policy maker, you have a profound understanding of this, and then you execute policy in a way which is aligned to this. It makes your effectiveness far higher. Right? So these are some of the practical ways in which some of these things can be implemented. But for that, there are two things need to be done. One, you need to acknowledge the fact that such a way of life exists in this country. without any pretense of existing otherwise, to establish, one of my attempts is to establish a qualitative framework based on the idea of dharma, which is the sort of root of this way of life that we're talking about today. And once you come to that understanding and acknowledgement, then we look at analyzing this and seeing how this way of life and attuning policy to that way of life can make policy making far more effective. Because eventually you want, in our, quest for Viksit Bharat, you have to have a buy-in of the people in the process, right? Not just urban, educated, anglicized elite, right? Probably BIC needs that buy-in. But if you really want to have the real Bharat, you need a buy-in of large sections of people. And as we move towards Viksit Bharat, remember there are two huge segments that need to make this transformation. One is the informal sector. The informal sector contributes almost 75-80% of employment in this country, even today. It contributes 30 to 40% of GDP. In an informal sector, your kirana shops that you see everywhere, most of their financing is done within the familial system, the cultural domain of the system. For example, if a small kirana shop goes bust, the familial system contributes financing to ensure that sustainability of that kirana shop first. And then after all these things doesn't work, he goes to the bank, he or she goes to the bank. So what I'm trying to say is there's a huge informal sector that needs to make this transformation. And this huge informal sector works on cultural norms and narratives, things like trust, things like community. These are central to their ecosystem, whether you like it or not. So, how do you deal with this and how do you ensure this transformation happens in a sustainable and very, effortless manner is also understanding this whole informal sector. And the second part of it is not just the informal sector, even within the formal domain, right? Corporate India is formal domain. But still your top 15, 20 businesses are all driven by family-owned enterprises, or at least the top 10 businesses.
And the norms and narratives come back there.
So, if for corporates to make decisions, major decisions, if you don't understand the psyche in which they're functioning, then I think there is an issue with policy, because you have to come to terms with this understanding. So that's where I see some of the practical.
I work on the informal sector, and what you're saying is music to my ears. However, the idea of informality in India is more like a jugaad system. Even in India, we call it jugaad, very unfortunately. It's actually an operating system. But it's not being recognized as an operating system because the direction is towards formality driven by a Western framework. How do you think we can create some kind of a hybrid, even if it isn't fully informal, which is, of course, we probably don't want one? How do we create a hybrid? And how do we bring the world to understand that this hybridization is perfectly normal?
Very valid question. That is precisely the point, ma'am. Because this narrative, formality is important, yes. But what is formality, right? For example, if most of the informal firms today are all digitized, right? Is being digital formal? If that's the case, we are already mostly formal, right? Formality and this, this sort of obsession with the Western definition of formality, I think we need to move beyond that. Because eventually, like what she mentioned, this hybrid norm is going to be the norm for a lot of people. Because there would be a lot of these firms who would want to be in their own structures that we're talking about, right? As long as you have a set of first principles, right? Corporate principles, you can call them, say transparency, proper taxation, say, for example, governance structures.
Labor protection,
right? If you're going to have a sort of first principles which are already sort of taken care by the informal structure, then I think we need to, come to terms with the fact that that's how they're going to be, right? Beyond which, pushing them into completely formal structure as defined by the Western norms is going to be counterproductive. Because most of these firms are all, either hundreds of years old or multiple generation-based firms. So I would say this hybrid structure is an important contribution. And then how do we take others on board? I think work such as this sort of help to push in that direction. Because you need credible research to showcase these ideas, not just for us, but for the rest of the world, to showcase that this is how our ecosystem is. For example, if you look at the Japanese have a very, very conservative society, far more conservative than us. And most of their things are all driven, most of the language is completely Japanese in communication everywhere. And most of their sort of corporate and economic values and thinking are all driven by Japanese cultural norms. In fact, the Japanese Ministry of Finance has a subdivision on on economic history, which plays an important role in elucidating policy. So what I'm trying to say is on positioning to the rest of the world, I think credible, authentic research without a political sort of bias, and engagement on these ideas in wider platforms. But I think this will gain credence, right? So that's where we are at a very important inflection point. This conversation that we are having, if I had it 10 years back, or 15 years back, or 20 years back, it would have not been a relevant conversation. But today, this conversation becomes relevant because in another 10, 15 years, when you are sort of third largest country in the world, and you become, en route to say $10 trillion economy, your ideas and your principles and norms take center stage because you are an example of a successful up-and-coming superpower. That context is very different to 20, 25 years back, right? So that makes a lot of the buy-in that we are seeking far more easier compared to before. So,
thanks.
If I can, and I'd like to posit a topic for you to consider as you answer the next set of questions. The notion of formalism takes us back to the 70s where we saw everybody who's not formal as being a price gouger or a profiteer. So that's why we negotiated everything, even with the smallest kirana, if you remember. If you take that same notion and progress it further, you also have examples of, the Tamil Nadu mercantile economy, which funded the British, which eventually used that same money to conquer us, if you may. How does Dharmic economics protect against it or maybe deal with it?
Right. So I would again go back to the first principles, right? What we are doing, what we are sort of used to is we have these notions of theories which a bunch of people, let's take the post-independent phase, right? And if you really look at the post-independent phase, much of the thinking, right, used to come from Delhi, right? And when I mean from Delhi, it's a bunch of people in Lutyens Delhi, most of them well-intentioned, especially in the economic policy space, but most of them are part of the same elite that we're talking about, right? So I'll give you an example. So I have a co-author of mine who's a very prominent economist, a very good friend of mine. So he was telling me about his PhD that he did in the 1970s in an Ivy League institute, okay? So I was telling him, look, you're talking about a PhD in an Ivy League institute in the 1970s, right? My grandmother was trying to find the next source of food for the next day during the time you were doing a PhD in Ivy League University, okay? That is the difference between the Bharat that was there and the India of the elite, right? So you had a situation where in the 70s, 60s, 70s, most of them are Western educated. Most of them well-intentioned, yes, but they come with a particular background. And that background is not necessarily aligned to the rest of Bharat, right? So you had a lot of policies which were sort of replications of what the West was into a Bharatiya model, right? As we are growing more and more, we are seeing that more and more of this is becoming irrelevant, right? More and more of this is sort of anathemical to how we are living and the issues and challenges that we are facing, right? So what I'm trying to say is the strictures that come through these, I think we need to move from that and move on first principles, on the role of principles. If you're looking at the Dharmic principles that I mentioned as a base for any form of iterative policy, okay, any localized entity can have an iterative policy. But as long as these first principles are followed, then it's a principles-based approach rather than a structure-based approach. Then you inherently provide flexibility, right? So this also leads to another issue that across India, across Bharat, there are various micro clusters and various dimensions to these micro clusters. So any sort of stricture or any sort of particular way of economic governance is going to at some point backfire. So instead of strictures, I think it's important to look at a principles-based approach. And that way, not only will you get a buy-in from the local community, you will also have the flexibility to have local models. So I'll finish up with this. So there's this brilliant book on how China escaped poverty. The author's name is not coming to my head, but I read it recently. So it talks about how the Chinese actually overcame, eliminate or try to eliminate poverty at such large scale in the last 30-35 years. If you really look at the way they did it, a lot of it is through this flexibility in decentralized thinking, right? Unlike the West, because though China is not democratic, I think because of the population and the complexity population provides, it gives us a segue into some of these ideas and how this inherent flexibility is important. And that's what you see, for example, with the Prime Minister. One quality that I really, that one needs to understand is he's probably the only Prime Minister after Lal Bahadur Shastri who's experienced poverty. No other Prime Minister, post-independence has experienced poverty as much as this current Prime Minister. So he understands the way of life, not probably through an economic, obviously through, he would understand the economics of it, but from a social lens. So he has, for example, the potential to see the importance of, say, Ujjwal Yojana, importance of a light in a house, a roof in a house, right? So what I'm trying to say is this ability to sort of understand local conditions, local norms, work through these principles, I think could be a better, more agile approach.
Just coming to capitalism, right? This is a great paper that I found on 5 models of capitalism. So, the definition goes something like this. Capitalism is not a mere abstraction, a market economy, but rather a historically situated economic system, which is always evolving, always reflecting technological change, and the political struggles through which ideologies and institutions are expressed. And it goes on further to say there are 5 forms of capitalism, more or less. The first is the sort of in the rich countries, there are 3, which is the liberal democratic Anglo-Saxon model, or the social European model, or you have the social integration-based Japanese model. Then in the developing world, you have the Asian developmental model, which is China and some of the other Asian tigers. And then you have the liberal dependent model that is probably Brazil. So these are your 5 models. And I'm quoting from your book now, which is essentially this idea that you map everything to broad themes of a rule-based yet non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook and in sustainable growth and welfare. These themes are based on clean administration, clean institutions, enforcement of rules, drivers of economic growth, having a global outlook, social welfare and well-being. So all sounds similar in a sense. So when we talk about Dharmanomics, is it just old wine in a new bottle, or what really differentiates it from what we're trying to understand?
Yeah, I think it's a completely new wine because, see, a lot of these models that you're talking about, right, they're all driven by the binary of the state and the market. There is the external entity of a lifestyle-driven approach, right? The closest is probably the Japanese model.
I was going to say, yeah.
Because the Japanese talk about societal integration,
yeah,
right? But what I'm trying to say is that the inherent motivation for an individual while making an economic choice is just not a rational choice, okay? The assumption of a lot of these models is that it's essentially a rational choice. I think even in the West, people have moved away from this narrative, where people realize that this prism of rationality has its own constraints, and there is a multi-dimensional approach to these choices. In this particular construct, we are talking about, I'm not trying to sort of make us somehow unique species. I'm not trying to come to that space. What I'm trying to say, articulate is that there is this way of life which is inherently solving some of these issues that we are talking about, right? Not because the state or not because we are talking about it. It's because there are thousands of years of experience that made them do this in this space, in this time, right? So this is a natural cause of action which has happened, right? And that cause of action, at least for in our land, I think, makes an important, contribution to how we want to progress. I'm saying, put it this way, right? I don't think this Dharmic model could be applicable for all the countries, right? I think for the sort of Bharatiya, structure and lifestyle, I think it's an important component, right? Of course, there are various iterations. Some of these components of it as individual components can be used in a variety of other spaces, right? But again, see, even if ethics, right? Ethics itself, when I translate it to English, it has its own shortcoming, right? Whereas when I say it is a dharmic thing to do, there's a multidimensional nature to it, right? English is a language because of its shortcoming cannot communicate this multidimensionality, right? But any person on a common person on the street, irrespective of his education, could sort of relate to this. So that's the essence I'm talking about, right? I'm not saying that this is a universal sort of approach to capitalistic, as an alternative to capitalism. In the Indian context, it's definitely, I would say, an integral sort of part of the Indian context, right? From a sort of Western, how other countries can sort of approach this would be through the prisms that are there in some of these ideas in their own, countries. But the point really is, much of this one-size-fit-all model, which was in the 60s, 70s sort of advocated as some gospel prism, even the West has moved away from it after the 2008 crisis. I mean, most of the, multilateral institutions or even all the Western sort of, models talk about, a customized sort of a much more holistic approach. Whether we have moved from it or not is a different story. But, I think, so answering a question, I think in the Bharatiya's, context, there is definitely a particular space with which this Dharmic, frameworks can play an important role.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.